your sign meant to be upside down?
Today we have a very interesting tale for you. Very interesting indeed. It is that time when F1 drivers went on strike just before a race. Ahead of the 1982 Formula One season, the governing body FISA, which stands for Fédération Internationale du Sport Automobile, decided that it wanted to have a bit more control over the drivers, and so tried to sneak a couple of new clauses into their super licenses, which ended up angering pretty much the entire grid. FISA decided that it wanted to make it illegal for any of the drivers to criticise the governing body, so that no matter how bad things were with the sport, and the early 1980s was a very turbulent time for F1, the drivers would only be allowed to say good things. But the one that really annoyed them was a rule stating that the drivers would no longer be allowed to negotiate contracts with other teams, and that the teams themselves would start to trade the drivers between each other without them having a say in which team they race for. Some drivers refused to sign up to these new terms, and on the Wednesday before the season-opening South African Grand Prix at Kyalami, don't know if I've said that right, but I'm going to continue, the dispute still wasn't settled. The drivers' representatives met up with the governing body to try and come to an agreement, but FISA President Jean-Marie Balest wasn't having any of it. He said, sign the license, or you cannot race. Take it or leave it. The drivers decided to leave it, the cheeky rebels. The first practice session was scheduled for Thursday, but none of the drivers were out on track. That's because first thing that morning, the Grand Prix Drivers Association arranged for a bus to the circuit, and as the drivers arrived, Lauda and Pironi, the two most vocal about the changes, ushered them onto it. As the bus full of drivers left the circuit, a member of the March team tried to block the exit with his car. So a few drivers jumped off the bus and pushed it out of the way before heading off to the Sunnyside Park Hotel about 5 miles away. At the circuit, Pironi had stayed behind in order to conduct negotiations and continuously relayed messages back to Lauda and the other drivers. The messages, they weren't good either. Brabham boss Bernie Ecclestone claimed he fired his drivers, Nelson Piquet and Riccardo Patrese, two very good ones may I add, while the Kyalami circuit said it was going to impound the cars if the race didn't go ahead. Then it was announced that the race would be postponed a week and that everyone taking part in the strike would be banned for life. Back at the hotel, the drivers had taken over a conference room. Even with the news coming from the circuit, they stood firm, despite the fact that some drivers didn't want to strike and only did so out of solidarity for those who did, and that some of the younger ones didn't really know what they were even striking for. Some team members also tried to bully their drivers into returning to the track, as for the smaller teams with sponsors to appease, not having any cars out on track could have dire consequences. But amazingly, none of them gave up what camaraderie. Well, except one person, Teo Fabi. Fabi was set to make his F1 debut for the Tolman team and decided that he didn't want to jeopardise his chances and left. Keke Rosberg thought the whole strike was a ridiculous idea and didn't want to be there, and yet he was furious with Fabi and said he ran like a chicken. There was even a story claiming that Fabi had escaped by climbing out of the toilet window, though Fabi insists it wasn't true. In the meantime, the drivers were finding ways to entertain each other. Gilles Villeneuve played some songs on the piano, but was then totally one-upped by Elio De Angelis, who played Mozart to the level of a concert pianist. Niki Lauda did a stand-up comedy routine, while Bruno Giacomelli drew cartoons and apparently did a particularly amusing routine using diagrams to explain how to dismantle an AK-47. There was no leeway on discussions back at the circuits, apart from a moment where several of the drivers' wags threw bread rolls at Balest. The drivers decided to settle down for the night, and in order to remain united, decided to have a big sleepover party in the dormitory. How fun. A load of mattresses were spread on the floor and they all went to sleep. Or at least they tried to. Apparently, Carlos Reutemann, who went to sleep in his race overalls, may I add, snored heavily throughout the night until Gilles Villeneuve covered him up with a blanket to mute the sound. The next morning, Pironi was back at the track negotiating. Meanwhile, Mas, who didn't have any part in the strike, decided to go out on track for a few cheeky laps. Around this time, Fiza and Bolest relented, saying that there would be a temporary truce, the race would go ahead as normal with no ramifications for the drivers, and that discussions would continue afterwards. The race itself was a pretty good one, as Alain Prost won for Renault despite suffering a mid-race puncture, which meant he had to charge back through from 8th to the lead. Afterwards, it turns out Bolest was talking absolute codswallop. All the drivers who took part in the strike received fines of up to $10,000, as well as suspended race bans. Furious with having been stabbed in the back, the drivers successfully appealed and had their fines and bans reduced. The FIA Court of Appeal also took a dim view of Bolest and Fiza and criticised them for trying to control what the drivers were able to do. As a result, the super licence was changed with 2 offending clauses removed. The strike had worked. What a story! How would you react if you were there about to watch a Grand Prix and all the drivers went on strike? Would you be proud of them? Angry of them? Let us know in the comment section below. And also, what you'd like to see next on That Time When.